A black CEO was denied first class, but just 9 minutes later, he bought the jet and fired the crew instantly. A black CEO was denied his first-class seat, thinking the airline could humiliate him with impunity. He didn't realize that in just 9 minutes, he would turn the tables completely. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when real authority acts. You've been moved to row 16. Economy Plus. First class is full. The sentence landed like a static jolt, quiet, sharp, unexpected. Dr. Kale Dravik stood still, briefcase in hand, his boarding pass extended midair. The hum of North Vance Terminal buzzed low around him, a blend of polished footsteps, murmuring travelers, and distant rolling luggage. Yet in this moment, everything dulled. Only the voice of the gate agent echoed, casual, almost dismissive. The agent's badge read Jaron Vale, and the flicker of unease that had danced across his face moments earlier had already been replaced by a professionally indifferent smile. Kale tilted his head slightly, his voice measured. That seat was booked, confirmed, and paid for. Jaron didn't blink. He tapped once more on the screen, as though the gesture might wipe away accountability. It's not personal. A VIP needed your seat. He didn't offer an apology, just a shrug, as though this sort of thing happened all the time. Maybe it did. Kale's grip on the boarding pass remained steady, but the rest of him shifted internally. Behind his eyes, a different calculation had already begun. Not rage, not confusion, just swift, surgical awareness. The kind a strategist feels when an opponent exposes a weakness early in the game. He stepped back, barely perceptible, his polished Oxford silent against the terminal's glossed flooring. Around him, the priority lounge gleamed with filtered light. Frosted glass panels framed the boarding gate. A server passed behind him, balancing a tray of espresso cups. Every detail in the terminal seemed tailored for calm and control. But that illusion had cracked now, and no one saw it except Kale. His expression remained placid. He gave a small nod. "I see," he said. Jaron had already moved on, calling the next passenger forward. To him, Kale was just another reshuffled body. But Kale Dravik was no ordinary traveler, and the decision that had just been made in haste would ripple farther than anyone expected. Kale turned from the counter without another word. He walked toward the jet bridge with a grace that suggested compliance. But each step marked a transition, from courtesy to clarity, from anonymity to intention. No one stopped him. No one apologized. The assumption was simple. He would accept the downgrade like everyone else. He scanned the cabin swiftly as he boarded. First class, visible for only a second through the half-drawn curtain, glowed with ambient light and empty luxury. A man in two, chuckled as he took a flute of champagne from a grinning flight attendant. Brent Doran, Kale registered. That name would matter later. Kale moved past it all, past the veneer of civility, past the idea of fairness. He reached row 16 and found his seat wedged between a man with an elbow firmly planted on the shared armrest and another with noise-canceling headphones already humming. There was no place to store his briefcase except beneath the seat. No water, no silence. He sat down slowly, placing his briefcase precisely at his feet. The nameplate on the case caught the light, a small, brushed steel emblem, Corvinix Industries. The symbol alone was worth more than half the seats on this plane. And yet, it hadn't been enough. Not today. He glanced toward the front of the aircraft, toward the curtain, now drawn fully shut. There was a time he might have called a supervisor, asked for clarification, asserted his rights as a passenger. But that time passed the moment he heard the word VIP. It wasn't the downgrade that mattered. It was the dismissal, the assumption that his presence in first class had been negotiable. But what Jaron Vale didn't know, and what no one on Havoc's Flight 909 yet understood, was that Kale Dravik had spent the last 11 months working behind the scenes to negotiate the acquisition of AeroVin Holdings, the parent entity of Havoc's Airlines itself. Through shell firms and embedded proxies, he had ensured his identity was shielded during the process. Even the board had only known him as a strategic buyer under the name Lyran Capital. The final meeting to seal the deal was hours away in Valmont City. He had been planning to sign it there, quietly, efficiently, without fanfare. But now, Cale looked down at a smartwatch, unlocked the secure interface, and slid open the encrypted messaging hub. He typed only 3 words: prepare early closure. He hit send. The hum of the plane's overhead systems masked the faint notification chime in his earpiece, but he felt the message land. His attorney would see it. His internal teams would adjust. The acquisition timetable would shift. Today, the closing signature would not wait for the Valmont office. It would happen in flight. Cale didn't blink as the plane began to board fully. Across from him, a child tapped the window with sticky fingers. Behind him, a passenger grumbled about carry-on space. All of it faded into background noise. Cale's mind was already moving beyond this cabin, beyond this aircraft, beyond even this airline. This wasn't just a slight. It was a miscalculation. He opened his tablet quietly and logged into a secure dashboard. The acquisition progress bar hovered at 81%. The legal documents were already staged in the background, waiting for authentication. All he had to do was trigger the final sequence. Cale folded his hands in his lap, his breath slow, his thoughts sharpened. They handed their fate to me over a seat. Cale didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or demand a supervisor. Instead, he walked to row 16 and quietly took his new seat, flanked by tired passengers with overstuffed bags and earbuds cranked high. The overhead bins were jammed with backpacks and half-zipped roller cases. A faint aroma of stale coffee clung to the air as someone coughed 2 rows behind. Cale eased into the narrow seat, the armrest already sticky from the last passenger's elbow. His long legs folded awkwardly beneath the tray table, knees grazing the seat in front of him. He exhaled once, quietly, then adjusted the cuff of his coat, dark navy, sharp-lined, perfectly pressed. His gaze flicked across the row ahead, over the curtain separating first class. It fluttered slightly each time someone passed behind it, a barrier made of cheap fabric that now stood between arrogance and consequence. As a steward clinked past with a half-empty bin of ice, Cale sat completely still. No outward sign of emotion. But inside, something had shifted. The removal wasn't just inconvenient. It was strategic negligence. Deliberate. And in that instant, the calculated man inside Cale Dravik made a quiet, irreversible decision. No one around him knew who he was. Not Jaron Vale, the smug gate agent with a hasty reassignment. Not the murmuring cabin crew up front. But Cale wasn't merely a well-dressed traveler with a black titanium watch and a briefcase that hummed quietly with biometric security. He was the architect of a silent takeover months in the making. For nearly half a year, Corvinix Industries had conducted discreet negotiations with the board of Aerovin Holdings, the elusive corporate parent of Havex Airlines. Shell firms, proxy contracts, off-site NDA summits. Cale had built the acquisition one handshake at a time, each clause more silent than the last. His legal team had operated under aliases. His signature had never appeared once in public. Even the final closure of the deal was meant to happen in Valmont, quietly, after wheels touched down. But that was before Jaron Vale made a choice that pulled the curtain too far. Cale reached into the inner lining of his coat and tapped his earpiece once. His voice, low and deliberate, cut through the channel. Encrypt. Line 1. A soft chime confirmed the connection. The earpiece vibrated slightly as his lead counsel, Darren Varick, answered on the other end. Standing by, came the reply. Advance acquisition closure, Cale said, his tone razor-flat. Include Flight 909 in asset control. Immediate crew audit. There was a pause. A pause just long enough for gravity to shift. Then, confirmed. Activation begins now. Cale closed his eyes for a moment. Not to rest, but to mark it. 9 minutes since the gate. 9 minutes since a seat reassignment triggered a corporate realignment. Outside, clouds drifted past the window in slow motion. Inside, momentum began to rewire itself. The screen embedded in the seat back flickered uselessly, still advertising vacation packages to places Cale had no interest in visiting. He ignored it. Instead, he retrieved his tablet, a matte black device with a secure biometric core, and opened the acquisition dashboard. A progress bar scrolled across the screen. 87%, 88%, 89%. He didn't need to watch it, but he did. The hum of the engines deepened slightly as the aircraft taxied toward takeoff. An attendant up front gave a half-hearted safety demonstration, waving a seatbelt like a disinterested magician. Cale didn't watch. His eyes were locked on the glowing numbers that were about to become fate. Another ding on the earpiece. Internal confirmation from Holdings board chair. Stakeholder transfer locked. Sir, you're now the controlling entity. Cale exhaled, slow and silent. His lips barely moved as he repeated the final thought that had crystallized the moment his name vanished from first class. They handed their fate to me over a seat. Brent Doran's laughter cut through the curtain like a blade. Made some room for you, sir. That guy in 1C didn't look like he belonged up here anyway. Cale Dravik didn't need to see him. The words painted the picture perfectly. His seat, 1C, had been reassigned, and now the man in it was being rewarded with a joke at his expense. From where Cale sat in row 16, cloaked in the subdued lighting of Economy Plus, he remained silent. His back straight, his breathing steady. But inside, something shifted. He leaned slightly toward the aisle, just enough to glimpse through the narrow crack between the drawn curtain and the wall. Brent, the first-class attendant, stood with a drink tray balanced on one hand, talking to a man with a relaxed posture and an overconfident grin in seat 2A, the so-called VIP. Cale had caught his name earlier during boarding when it flashed briefly on the handheld scanner. Marin Vale. Not an ambassador, not a government liaison, not even an executive of rank. Just a mid-level marketing manager attached to Havex's sponsorship accounts. His connection? A cousin on the operations board. Nepotism in a tailored blazer. Marin chuckled in response, tilting his head back arrogantly. Yeah, I saw. Thought he was cabin crew. Cale's jaw didn't move, but his fingers did, just a slight flex of the knuckles resting atop the closed lid of his tablet. The insult wasn't personal. It wasn't even surprising. What stung was the familiarity of it. The quiet assumption, the gleeful dismissal of presence over pedigree. The belief that a seat, bought, confirmed, paid for, could be stripped away simply because someone more familiar wanted it. He unlocked his tablet. The screen lit up with a secure app already open, showing a percentage bar slowly crawling forward. 92%, 93%, 94%. Corvinix Holdings' acquisition of Aerovin Holdings, the parent company of Havex Airlines, had entered its final phase. Cale had orchestrated the deal in silence for nearly 6 months, hiding behind shell firms and silent partners. No one in the cabin knew that the man seated in row 16 was about to own the company flying the plane. He tilted the screen slightly, enough to shield it from any curious eyes across the aisle, though no one was looking. His cabin mates were half asleep, lost in podcasts and in-flight magazines. But Cale was wide awake. Not angry, just cold. He watched Brent again, who was now wiping his hands on a napkin and pouring whiskey for Marin with the kind of forced charm typically reserved for superiors. Anything else I can get you before we close service, sir? Marin leaned back, smug. Nah, this is perfect. Appreciate the bump. Some people don't get how the system works. Cale's eyes narrowed slightly. No, he thought. They don't. They don't understand that systems bend, that policies shift, that power wears more than just uniforms and badges. Sometimes, it wears cufflinks and silence. He tapped the corner of the tablet and swiped to a communication interface, a private channel reserved for high-priority financial activations. His legal counsel had already been briefed. Only Cale could trigger the final cascade. He hovered his finger over the send key, but didn't press it. Not yet. From behind the curtain, Marin's voice echoed again. What's the ETA on this flight, by the way? Brent answered lazily, couple hours. Shouldn't be any delays unless someone starts complaining again. Hope no one causes drama, Marin said with mock concern. Some people just can't handle being in the back. That was it. Cale tapped Initiate Control Sequence. A confirmation prompt appeared. He authorized it with biometric verification. A small green bar began to rotate. Activation pending. His eyes remained fixed ahead, where only minutes ago he had seen arrogance dressed as privilege, passed off as protocol. What they didn't realize, what they hadn't stopped to consider, was that every decision made on this flight was being absorbed, recorded, and about to be recalibrated. He exhaled slowly and reopened the acquisition app. The percentage ticked upward. 95%, 96%. A soft ding announced another service call light. Kel didn't press his. He no longer needed anything. Let them pour their ignorance, he murmured quietly, eyes still on the screen, while I pour the ink. Cale pressed the service button. A soft chime rang overhead, but it didn't take long for Brent Doran to arrive with a scowl already painted across his face. His steps were clipped, purposeful, less like service, more like enforcement. The aircraft had just stabilized after a brief tremor of turbulence, and while most attendants might use the moment to reassure passengers, Brent looked as if he had been interrupted from something far more important. He stopped beside Cale's seat in row 16, hands on his hips, scanning the cabin like a sentry. His voice came low, sharp. "Economy's behind the curtain, sir. First class isn't doing drink runs for the whole plane." Cale's gaze rose slowly, measured, unblinking. He didn't answer at first. There was no reason to. The contrast between Brent's tone and Cale's composure created a silence that stretched unervingly long. Finally, Cale said, almost inaudibly, "You'll want to remember this moment later." Brent chuckled, a short, mocking sound that lacked any warmth. He took a step closer, lowering his voice, but not enough to prevent nearby passengers from overhearing. "What? You gonna file a complaint?" He leaned in. "You people are always quick to act like victims." The words landed not just with insult, but with an arrogance so ingrained it sounded rehearsed. A reflex. Cale didn't react. Not visibly. His jaw didn't clench, his eyes didn't narrow. But something behind them changed, an internal switch, quiet and irreversible. He inhaled once through his nose and, without answering, turned his focus to the tablet on his lap. The screen flickered awake, revealing a digital dashboard in muted blue hues. He tapped twice, confirming the biometric unlock, and the interface adjusted, revealing the acquisition pipeline status. Brent was still watching him, perhaps expecting another challenge. But Cale didn't acknowledge him. The page on the tablet refreshed, and in one clean motion, a series of percentages began to cascade upward, blinking green one after the other. 92%, 93%, 94%. Cale murmured under his breath, almost with reverence. "Your arrogance has just timed itself perfectly." Brent scoffed, mistaking the comment as posturing, and walked off toward the galley with an exaggerated shake of his head. The man truly believed he'd won some small power game. Another insignificant passenger put his place. He had no idea the game had already ended. The final update arrived with a single, quiet vibration against Cale's palm. Ownership, Corvinix Holdings. Parent stakeholder, Dr. Cale Dravik. Activation confirmed. Cale exhaled slowly. The title was no longer pending. The board sign-off had cleared through secure encryption nodes tied to 3 blind shell companies, and the final documentation had passed through the Aerovin Holdings internal compliance server less than 90 seconds ago. The ownership chain, deliberately obfuscated until this moment, was now crystallized in law. Outside the aircraft, no one on the runway knew. Inside the aircraft, no one in the cockpit knew. But Cale did. He looked toward the front of the plane, past the curtain that divided him from Brent, from Marin Vale, from whatever false sense of superiority they wielded. It wasn't the curtain that separated class now. It was understanding. Brent had been policing a seat he didn't realize belonged to the man in row 16. Cale leaned back, adjusting his cuffs with mechanical precision. Every movement was now deliberate, timed to a rhythm only he understood. The tablet dimmed again, its screen now showing a single prompt. Execute? He didn't tap it. Not yet. He let the moment linger, soaking in the irony. A man had just mocked him for asking for water, certain in his hierarchy. But now, without raising his voice or declaring his identity, Cale held the entire flight's future in his palm. He scanned the rows in front of him. Passengers were murmuring, unaware. A boy was kicking the back of his seat lightly. An elderly man nearby adjusted his hearing aid, and a young businessman several seats up scrolled idly through a spreadsheet, headphones in. Everyone was returning to their normal Madeira rhythms. Everyone but Kale. The turning point wasn't coming. It had arrived. Brent's insult hadn't triggered outrage. It had triggered authorization. Kale's thumb hovered over the screen one last time before he whispered to himself. Not for effect, not for an audience, but as a personal reminder of the timeline that had now locked into place. And now the flight belongs to me. Kale stood. No hositación. No rustle of uncertainty. His hands moved with quiet precision as he adjusted the button on his coat and stepped into the narrow aisle. The aircraft had stabilized after the mild turbulence, the cabin humming with the soft thrum of jet engines and the occasional shuffle of passengers stretching in their seats. But inside Kale, the tension had already snapped. The moment had arrived, not by force, but by design. He tapped his discreet earpiece, a single nod to a sequence already set in motion. His voice was calm, but surgical. This is Dravik. Execute. There was no fanfare. No dramatiquecho. Just 3 minutes of silence, long enough to feel like a pause in the air itself. Then, the overhead speakers crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, the captain began, voice level but with a taut undercurrent. This is Captain Torrin Vale. Due to a technical flag received from our corporate oversight team, we will be initiating a priority landing at Havenport Airstrip. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions. A ripple of confusion passed through the rows. A few passengers muttered. Others looked at their watches, brows furrowed. But Kale wasn't listening to them. He was already moving. His shoes made no sound on the thin carpet as he approached the first-class curtain. The same divider that earlier marked exclusion, now about to collapse under the weight of authority. As he neared the partition, Brent Doran stepped forward sharply, blocking his path with outstretched arms. "Sir," Brent said, his voice firm but laced with the brittle confidence of someone used to control. "You need to return to your seat." Kale stopped just short of the curtain, facing him directly. The cabin lights above them created stark shadows across Brent's face, emphasizing the smugness in his jaw, the certainty in his posture, an illusion about to fracture. Kale didn't raise his voice. He didn't blink. He simply said, "You don't work here anymore." For a beat, silence held between them like static. Brent let out a short, incredulous laugh, tilting his head slightly. "What? You think you're in charge?" he scoffed, lips curling. "This isn't a movie, sir. Return to your seat before I call the—" He never finished the sentence. From mid-cabin, the cockpit door opened, and the co-pilot stepped out, tall, composed, with a yellow folder in his hand. He made his way toward them with steady strides, ignoring the murmurs rising from the rows of passengers, now watching with open curiosity. He leaned close to Brent and spoke quietly, his voice low but firm enough that Kale and the few passengers nearby could catch fragments. Corporate authority, immediate implementation, sealed instruction packet. Brent's shoulders stiffened. "What are you talking about?" The co-pilot handed him the folder without expression. Brent looked down, eyes scanning the stamped envelope. A silver foil seal bearing the insignia of Corvinix Holdings glinted in the cabin light. As he tore it open, his hands trembled. His eyes moved left to right, reading faster with every line. His posture changed visibly, chin lowering, color draining from his cheeks. "No," he muttered, breath catching. This can't be real." His voice had dropped to a whisper. The authority that once filled his stance had withered, replaced by something else, something rawer. Disbelief. "Effective immediately," he read aloud, barely able to finish the words. "Your employment with Havex Airlines is terminated." Passengers leaned into aisles. Phones discreetly tilted. The once dominant flight attendant stood frozen in the center of his own domain, reduced to a silhouette of arrogance undone. Kale stepped past him, gaze unwavering. He didn't push. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. Instead, he passed close enough to speak clearly, his voice calm and low but with enough resonance to carry. "Reality doesn't check your comfort. It checks your choices." The plane's wheels struck the tarmac with a crisp, jarring thud. No applause followed. Only a dense, collective silence. A strange stillness seemed to settle over the cabin as if the passengers, sensing something unnatural in the descent, were waiting for answers. Outside, past the oval windows, the landscape looked unfamiliar. No control towers, no taxiing traffic, just a stretch of tarmac flanked by low hangars and a thin line of black sedans idling beside the runway. A group of uniformed men in dark blue blazers stood at attention beneath a slate-gray sky. No lobos, no smiles. Inside the cabin, confusion rippled like static. "This isn't Valmont," someone muttered behind Cale. From overhead, the intercom crackled. Captain Torrin Vale's voice returned, more clipped this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Select personnel will be deboarding first under executive review protocol. Further instructions will follow shortly. Thank you for your cooperation." The term executive review protocol hung in the air like a foreign language. Whispered questions stirred across aisles. Cale remained in his seat, expression unreadable, his coat still perfectly smooth, hands resting calmly on the fold-out tray before him. His eyes, however, were locked forward, just past the curtain, where first class still retained its illusion of superiority. Brent Doran, the flight attendant who only an hour earlier had mocked him, stiffened. His posture betrayed a man who suddenly realized the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He turned sharply to a nearby crew member and hissed, "What is this? What's going on?" His voice, once full of control, was now threaded with panic. The answer came not from his colleague, but from the aisle. Boots clicked softly along the cabin floor. A uniformed flight marshal entered, broad-shouldered, with a trimmed beard and the firm composure of someone long used to tension. He carried a black folder tucked beneath one arm and didn't waste time. He raised his voice so every row could hear. "Mr. Brent Doran, Mr. Marin Vale, Mr. Jaron Vale, please collect your belongings and step forward." Gasps. The cabin froze. Brent's face flushed a deep crimson. "You can't be serious," he barked. "On what grounds?" Jaron Vale, the gate agent seated mid-cabin in an unused jump seat, sat bolt upright, his mouth hanging slightly open. Marin, the so-called VIP, shifted uncomfortably in his first-class seat, trying to form a response. None came. Cale stood. He didn't rush. Each movement was deliberate, silent, unhurried, like the ticking of a clock just before it chimes. He walked up the aisle, passing row after row of stunned passengers. No one stopped him. Some stared. Others sat frozen, watching the slow unraveling of something far bigger than a diverted landing. Cale stopped just short of Brent and spoke, not with heat, not with volume, but with precision. "Your behavior was the audit," he said, his voice like cooled steel. "The flight was the test, and your failure is now policy." For a moment, Brent didn't move. He stared into Cale's eyes, searching for some trace of bluff, some hint of exaggeration. But all he found was certainty. The marshal stepped beside Brent, extended the black folder, and held it open. A sealed envelope rested inside, bearing the Havoc seal and Corvinik's subsidiary insignia. Without a word, it was handed over. Brent tore it open, his fingers trembling. As he scanned the document, his lips parted slowly, barely managing a whisper. Termination, immediate. Marin stood unsteadily, his phone clutched in one hand. "This has to be a mistake. I'm on the sponsor relations board." The marshal turned to him and offered a second envelope. Jaron, still seated near the back, tried to rise but paused mid-motion, watching the dominoes fall toward him. Cale stepped aside and let the silence fill the gaps their excuses once occupied. The three men, previously emboldened by hierarchy, protocol, and ego, now stood separated not by rows, but by truth. Their downfall wasn't orchestrated in rage. It was revealed through their own choices. Cale didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He merely watched as the marshal signaled, and the door hatch was released with a mechanical hiss. The wind outside picked up, brushing through the cabin like a cleansing breath. Each man, Brent, Marin, and Jaron, was let out of the plane one by one. There were no handcuffs, no public shame, only the quiet certainty of consequence. The passengers remained still, watching through the windows as the trio was guided to separate sedans, where doors opened and then closed without ceremony. No words were exchanged. Back inside the aircraft, Cale slowly turned, meeting the eyes of a few passengers still peeking over their headrests. Some nodded quietly. Others looked away, unsure of how to process what they'd just witnessed. Cale exhaled, long and controlled, then began his walk back toward row 16. Behind him, a new reality had begun to settle, the kind that doesn't make announcements. It makes policy. And just before he passed through the center curtain, Cale said quietly but clearly enough for the cabin to hear, "Your behavior was the audit. The flight was the test. And your failure is now policy." The metal doors slammed shut behind them. Brent Doran, Marin Vale, and Jaron Vale were each ushered off the aircraft by stern-faced operatives in crisp Navy blazers. No handcuffs, no shouted orders. Just quiet, controlled authority. Their movements were recorded by 2 camera operators standing on the tarmac, their lenses following every step without commentary. The silence outside the aircraft was more jarring than any noise. The wind scraped faintly across the concrete, and beyond the row of dark sedans waiting for them, the horizon stood still, as if the entire world was pausing to witness. Brent looked over his shoulder in disbelief. "This is insane," he muttered, resisting slightly as one of the escorts opened a rear door of a vehicle. "You can't just haul us out like this. We didn't break any law." The operative beside him didn't answer. Instead, he held up a sealed folder, marked with the Corvinix emblem in silver. Brent snatched it and flipped it open with shaking fingers. Inside, a single-page document spelled it out in language that was cold, formal, and absolute. Termination of employment, effective immediately. Grounds: executive conduct review failure, policy violation, reputational risk. He read it twice before Marin leaned in, tried to catch a glimpse of his own copy. Jaron, meanwhile, stood stiff beside the other sedan, white-knuckling his phone, but unable to find signal. "They cut the tower," he whispered to himself. "They've shut down the whole terminal." Inside the plane, passengers watched from their windows, some pressing hands to the glass. Confusion, curiosity, and awe rippled through the cabin like a second atmosphere. An older man near the wing whispered, "Who was that guy that moved out of first class?" Then the cabin intercom chimed. Cale stood in the front galley, one hand resting lightly on the PA receiver, the other tucked behind his back. The silence inside was different from outside, electric suspended. Every head turned. Every ear waited. "This is Dr. Cale Dravik," he began, his voice steady, warm but ironed with control. "I'm a new controlling stakeholder of Havex Airlines." Gasps swept through the aisles, but he didn't pause. His tone remained unchanged, measured, unhurried, but unmistakably final. "I apologize for the disruption you've experienced today. What occurred aboard this flight was more than an inconvenience. It was a demonstration of why change is no longer optional." A hush fell across even the children. People who'd been restless now sat perfectly still. Cale continued, his voice now carrying something deeper, a current of quiet conviction. 3 individuals who engaged in conduct beneath the standard expected of this airline have been removed from duty. Their decisions reflected neither the policies we claim to uphold nor the values passengers deserve. He let the pause linger, not for dramatics, but for gravity. This flight will continue shortly. All passengers will be served equally. Water and meals will be distributed without distinction. And the new first officer on board will ensure that every interaction moving forward reflects the dignity every traveler deserves. A flight attendant, one who had arrived during the emergency crew shift, stood just beyond the curtain, listening with wide eyes. He gave a small nod, recognizing the signal in Cale's words. Cale's eyes moved slowly across the cabin. He didn't need applause. He didn't want it. What he wanted was awareness, clarity, the kind that couldn't be undone by time or spin. He spoke once more, his words now slower, more deliberate. "Thank you for your patience." He reached for the switch to end the broadcast, but stopped for one final note. A line that would later be repeated in headlines, shared on forums, quoted in boardrooms, and printed in memos. And thank you for witnessing the end of an era." The crew laughed, confident their decision would go unchecked, unaware that every signature, transfer, and acquisition had already been finalized, and that their jobs hung in the balance. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when skill and power intervene, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Cale didn't wait for applause, nor did he expect it. The moment the aircraft door sealed and the refueling hose clamped beneath the fuselage, he rose from his seat in row 16 with quiet purpose. The muted chime of the overhead signal was still fading as he stepped forward, eyes trained not on the luxurious front cabin that had once been his rightful place, but on the silence left in its wake. First class was empty now. Brent, Marin, and Jaren had all been escorted off just minutes earlier, swallowed into a line of black sedans under the gray sky beyond the window. But Cale wasn't returning for revenge or reclamation. He was returning to observe. As he passed through the open curtain, the temperature in the cabin seemed to shift, not literally, but in tone. Heads turned. Whispers started. The few remaining passengers in the premium section straightened in their seats, unsure whether to speak or sit quietly in the presence of the man whose calm had rewritten the flight's direction. A new attendant, young, well-groomed, with trembling hands, stood near the galley door, clearly out of breath. He'd been called in under emergency request, rerouted mid-shift from a nearby standby post. His name tag read Kellen. Kellen's eyes widened the instant Cale approached, recognition blooming not just from briefing documents, but from whispered cabin chatter that had already begun to spread like static. He stood upright, smoothing his vest. "Dr. Dravik," he said, voice tight with reverence and fear. Welcome aboard again, sir." Cale gave a faint nod, neither dismissive nor overly familiar. "Thank you, Kellen," he said calmly. "But I'm not here to take a seat up front." He looked around, noting the empty seat 1C, the original point of contention, and then passed it toward the back. "I'm returning to row 16. The attendant blinked. "You're declining an upgrade, sir?" Cale turned slightly. The lesson wasn't about being seen in first class. It was about being heard in silence. Without further word, he passed through the curtain again, back into Economy Plus, where a small storm of whispers had begun to swirl. A passenger in 17 nudged his companion and pointed subtly. Others craned their necks, pretending not to watch. Cale settled into 16C with the same composure he had shown from the beginning. Around him, the cabin shifted from awkward to reverent. The man in 16B, a soft-spoken business traveler with a tan laptop bag, leaned forward and murmured with cautious awe, "Sir, I've flown over 100 times and never seen anything like that." Cale's gaze didn't waver. He simply replied, voice even, "Neither had I. That's why it was necessary." The man nodded slowly, his mouth slightly parted, as if something in Cale's tone had revealed more than the words themselves. Across the aisle, a teenager discreetly lifted his phone, trying to record, but Cale's quiet glance dissuaded him. This wasn't about going viral. This was about recalibration. What few knew, even those on board, was that the entire sequence of events had been recorded. Once the priority landing was triggered, an internal safety protocol had activated discrete cabin cams mounted in key overhead panels. These cameras weren't typically used unless there was a security breach or in-flight incident report. But Cale's acquisition authority had granted instant access. Every word Brent had uttered, every dismissive shrug, every misplaced smirk, captured, time-stamped, preserved. That footage would remain sealed in internal compliance archives. But not all of it. A curated segment, time-stamped from the moment Cale was denied water to Brent's removal, was already being prepared by Corvinix's legal team for strategic transparency distribution. That was the phrase they used. What it meant was simple. The public wouldn't be left to wonder. They would see, not everything, but enough. Enough to recognize that what unfolded wasn't a tantrum or a spectacle. It was accountability enacted mid-air. As Cale sat in his seat, arms resting calmly on the armrests, his thoughts were neither angry nor celebratory. He was thinking about precedent, about the many flights where someone like him, someone who looked like him, spoke with deliberate grace, and moved with quiet precision, had been minimized, relocated, or ignored. He wasn't alone. He had just been the one to draw a line high enough for everyone to see. The engines roared softly as the refueling finished. Outside the window, the last of the ground crew saluted the cockpit and retreated into their vehicles. Inside, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as a soft chime signaled final preparation for takeoff. The man in 17D clapped, once unsure if he should. Then someone else joined in. A slow ripple, subtle but unmistakable, passed through several rows. Not thunderous applause, just acknowledgement. Cale didn't stand. He didn't bow. He sat quietly, letting it pass, unmoved yet deeply centered. In the galley, Kellen whispered into his comm. He's back in 16C. Declined upgrade. The reply crackled back. Understood. Proceed with reservice. And as trays were prepared and water poured equally, row by row, regardless of class, the message moved faster than the wheels of the plane could. It wasn't just about Dr. Cale Dravik anymore. It was about what he'd refused to become. A victim, a showman, a tyrant. He had chosen to be something rarer, a standard, because as Cale sat among the same passengers who had once barely noticed him, he understood the weight of every silent second. Not every legacy is loud, and accountability always lands harder than arrogance. The wheels had barely kissed the tarmac at Valmont International when the storm began. Inside the cabin of Flight 909, phones buzzed with reception returning. Dozens of notifications flared to life as passengers refreshed inboxes and feeds. A hushed wave of surprise moved seat to seat like a quiet contagion. The footage had leaked. A young analyst in row 17 gasped audibly, his phone trembling in his grip. It's already online, he muttered. The man beside him leaned over. What is? The analyst turned the screen. There was grainy at first, then stabilizing into clarity. The gate agent, Jaron Vale, telling Dr. Cale Dravik that his seat had been reassigned. The words were clear. A VIP needed your seat. Then the cut to Brent Doran's sneer as he denied a glass of water. First class isn't doing drink runs for the whole plane. The line that followed, you people are always quick to act like victims, sparked a visible shift in the cabin's atmosphere. No one was laughing now. Cale, still seated in row 16, watched with measured breath as a ping reached his private device. His comms director, Aaron Veller, had sent the drafted release. He scanned it silently, then tapped a single word, approve. Within 38 seconds, it was live. Across the Corvinix network and aligned PR circuits, the headline hit with force. Corvinix Industries confirms executive takeover of Havek's parent entity following in-flight audit. The phrase in-flight audit ignited like dry kindling. Forum up. Whispers in shareholder threads turned to roars. Messages flew through encrypted investor groups and boardroom chats. Executives of rival airlines sent texts that began with, "Have you seen?" Back on board, a man in a gray business vest turned in his seat and studied Cale closely. "Sir," he said quietly, "you just redefined what a Midair power move looks like." Cale didn't respond. His thoughts were already in motion, projecting past the touchdown into the glass conference room waiting for him in Valmont. A company was about to change hands. The black sedan pulled up precisely 6 minutes after the aircraft docked. No red carpet, no press, just 2 security detail agents flanking the door as Cale stepped down the metal stairwell of the aircraft that, by every legal metric, now belonged to him. He entered the vehicle in silence, the door clicking shut like a vault ceiling. The ride to the Virulon deal site was short and silent. The building loomed tall and sharp. Floor 42. Boardroom glass thick as resolve. Cale entered without announcement. The room was half-filled, lawyers, finance chiefs, acquisition leads. All eyes turned. One advisor, Dean Harvin, a man in his 50s with a cautious brow, stood and gestured toward the waiting documents. "We just received word," he said. "The takeover footage, it's gone viral in investor circles. Some are calling it an industry ethics milestone." Cale removed his coat slowly and draped it over the chair. The same coat he had worn while seated in Economy Plus. He took his seat without ceremony, picked up the pen, and reviewed the final acquisition contract for Virulon Systems. Every detail aligned. The work of months culminating here, not with fanfare, but with deliberate resolve. He signed. No handshake followed, only the quiet press of ink and intent. Dean hesitated before speaking again. Dr. Dravik, would you like us to issue formal apologies to the crew involved? Brent, Jaren, Marin, they're trending as well. There's speculation, commentary. Some say it may help public image if we... Cale didn't look up. He closed a folder with a soft finality. No apologies, he said. His voice was steady, stripped of emotion, heavy with decision. Just change. He turned toward the projection screen, still displaying the new HAVX transition slide deck. The company logo now bore the Corvinix insignia, subtly etched beneath it. And make sure the next safety video includes a segment on basic respect. Cale Dravik's gaze was fixed on the report in front of him when the alert chimed softly on his desktop. It was the compiled passenger feedback from Flight 909, categorized, time-stamped, and verified by Corvinix's internal ethics team. He tapped the side of the glass screen, enlarging the first page. Dozens of lines poured down, each one a first-hand account from passengers aboard the now infamous flight. His finger hovered, and he began to read. Some messages were brief. Thank you. Never seen anything like that. Others carried the tone of quiet awe. One entry from father in row 19 described how his 10-year-old son had asked why the man in the suit never got angry. Cale paused on that line. He leaned back in his chair and turned toward the window, the late afternoon sun bouncing off the Corvinix tower across the street. He didn't smile, but his jaw loosened. It was that question, why didn't he get angry, that made it clear something had taken root far deeper than retaliation. Something that would last. Then he found it. The subject line was unassuming, from a passenger near row 17. The body read, "Sir, I just wanted to say your silence was louder than any shout. I learned more in that flight than in any leadership course I've taken. What you did, it wasn't about proving power. It was about showing control. I hope one day I can lead like that. Sincerely, Devin Reller, Communications Intern, Virulon Systems." Cale's hand hovered over the reply button for only a moment before turning instead to his private comms panel. "Miles," he said, addressing his executive assistant. "Flag this passenger, Devin Reller. I want to brought into our internship program. Elevate it. Place him under executive mentoring." There was a pause on the other end before the voice responded, surprised but certain. Right away, Cale closed the screen and exhaled slowly. That ripple, one quiet voice from row 17, had validated every choice he'd made since being displaced from his seat. It wasn't the public headlines or investor applause. It was the unnoticed impact that had taken root in someone watching from the sidelines. Across the table, a second screen displayed the latest legal response packets prepared by Human Resources. Each was a letter addressed to the former staff involved, Brent Doran, Jaren Vale, and Marin Vale. No threats, no lawsuits, just options, mediation, counseling referrals, transition assistance. They didn't deserve ruin. They deserved to face the mirror. Cale tapped the first letter and reread the final line aloud. Accountability is not punishment. It is the choice to walk forward differently. He approved all three and signed the dispatch order. Yet even as he did, a quiet storm brewed beneath the still surface of his focus. The events on Flight 909 had sparked far more than policy change. Whispers within Corvinix's ethics review board suggested that internal favoritism within HAVX ran deeper. Names had surfaced. Patterns were forming. The next wave of reform would need more than press releases. And still, the public didn't know the full story. Not yet. The leaked clips were just fragments. Intentional ones. Controlled glimpses of what restraint looked like in real time. But Cale knew what came next, what always came next. Once dignity was made visible, it could no longer be dismissed. It forced reflection, and it taught. He pulled out a note card from the inner pocket of his jacket. It was creased at the edges, the ink slightly faded. Devin's message had been transcribed in Cale's own handwriting earlier that morning. Your silence was louder than any shout. He placed the card back in his coat and stood, his silhouette casting a long shadow across the polished floor of the executive conference room. The city beyond the windows had begun to dim, but inside, something was gaining clarity. He walked slowly toward the door, his hand resting on the frame for a moment. Then, without turning, he said to the room behind him, the goal was never ruin. It was revelation. The training room fell silent as the video reached the 10-minute mark. On the screen, the cabin footage paused at a moment that many might have considered unremarkable. Dr. Cale Dravick, adjusting his coat as he returned to seat 16C, unbothered on the surface, his gaze calm, posture straight. But for the new recruits at Havex Airlines, this was not just a clip, it was doctrine. The man in the video had been humiliated in silence, moved from first class by a manipulated reassignment, and had responded not with outrage, but with calculated resolve. The lesson wasn't in what he said. It was in what he chose not to say. Pause it there, the training officer instructed, stepping forward. The screen froze on Cale's still frame, illuminated by the soft cabin lighting. This is where it all changed. Not when he fired the crew. Not when he revealed ownership. Here, when he chose dignity over drama. In the weeks that followed the Flight 909 incident, Cale wasted no time enacting institutional overhaul. The boardroom of Corvinix buzzed with late-night calls, compliance drafts, and oversight strategy sessions. A single priority echoed through every conversation. No passenger, regardless of background, status, or appearance, would ever again be quietly displaced for favoritism, nepotism, or internal politics. The result, the Dravick policy. The rollout was swift. A new executive oversight division was formed, separate from Havex's traditional HR and operations branches. Their first task? Install a verification layer between crew assignments and seat reallocation permissions. Every passenger reassignment now required time-stamped digital confirmation tied to ID-based audits. Staff could no longer make arbitrary changes behind screen. Everything was traceable. Cameras were quietly installed at boarding gates and cabin walkways, not to intimidate, but to document. Cale didn't want control. He wanted accountability. Cale personally reviewed the reform blueprint late into the night, hunched over a digital draft filled with track changes and notes. One clause made him pause. Discretionary upgrades permitted upon crew approval. He struck it through. No, merit, not moods, he muttered. He replaced it with a new clause. Upgrades and reassignment must reflect verified criteria approved through executive protocols. No exceptions. At the first company summit post-incident, Cale took the stage with no fanfare. He wasn't there to celebrate reform. He was there to embed it. Hundreds of employees filled the room, some new, others veterans shaken by the shakeup. Cale's tone was firm but calm. I've reviewed every frame, he began, referring to the in-flight footage. And the moment that changed, everything wasn't explosive. It wasn't public. It wasn't loud. It was when I sat back down, quiet, unmoved. That silence taught me more than a confrontation ever could. He stepped forward, eyes scanning the room. You'll be tempted, one day, to act out of impulse. Maybe to bend rules for someone you know. Maybe to brush aside a passenger who doesn't match your expectations. But in that moment, remember what happened next. His voice sharpened. The world watched. Investors reacted. And now, this airline stands on a new edge, not just of altitude, but of ethos. Tension hung in the air, a stillness that demanded reflection. Then Cale said the line that would echo throughout every training manual, onboarding packet, and cabin staff orientation for years to come. Strength is not proven by how you strike. It's proven by how you absorb pressure without bending into it. The room held its breath. Some scribbled notes. Some nodded slowly. No one spoke. Later that week, internal communications sent a final draft of the Dravick policy to all personnel. It wasn't just procedure, it was philosophy. From now on, every Havex aircraft would log reassignment records in real time. Captains would have direct escalation lines to the oversight board. Gate agents received a new tool, a digital check-in verification prompt that would flag unverified reassignments instantly. Supervisors were retrained not just in compliance, but in conscience. In simulation rooms across terminals, role plays now included not just how to de-escalate conflict, but how to recognize it before it begins. How to read discomfort, bias, subtle slights. How to ask before acting. Would I do this if I didn't know who he was? Kale reviewed the final implementation report a few days later. No press conference. No interviews. He didn't need the world to clap. He needed it to shift. At the bottom of the rollout memo was a quote printed on every internal handbook from that day forward. It came from the summit speech. It wasn't a rule. It was a reminder. Strength is not proven by how you strike. It's proven by how you absorb pressure without bending into it. The envelope was plain. No return address. Just a soft gloss off-white surface and a carefully written line of ink across its center. Dr. Kale Dravic, Corvinix Holdings. It arrived among dozens of memos, policy updates, and regulatory filings, but it was the only one that had been handwritten. Kale sliced it open with his finger, the paper catching slightly as he unfolded the letter inside. His eyes scanned the first line. I watched the footage. I saw myself laughing. I thought it was just a seed at the time. I didn't realize it was a mirror. His thumb paused at the crease. The signature at the bottom was familiar. Marinvale. Kale exhaled through his nose, not out of frustration nor forgiveness. Just reflection. The words carried no deflection, no defense. Only something rarer, recognition. He read on. At first I thought someone edited it to make me look foolish. But it wasn't the footage. It was me. The moment Brent made that comment, I laughed because it made me feel powerful. But I didn't stop to ask why that power came at someone else's expense. I see it now. I needed to write this not to clear my name, but to confront it. I apologize for what I was in that moment. And I hope whatever you're building next leaves no room for that kind of ignorance. Kale stared at the final period. The handwriting was tight, controlled, not performative. It was the kind of script written slowly, when each word felt heavier than the last. He folded the letter quietly and walked over to a brushed metal cabinet marked Confidential Archives. Inside, a file labeled Lessons Noted. It wasn't thick. Just 3 letters, 1 memo, and a photo from an old summit where he once stood behind the scenes, unseen by the press. He slid the envelope into the folder and closed it gently. Elsewhere, Brent Doran's name reappeared on Kale's radar, but not in scandal. It was a regional news clip forwarded by an associate. A modest seminar hall, a plastic banner that read, Inclusive Communication Workshop, and Brent, now bearded and notably quieter, addressing a seated group of local municipal workers. The truth is, most bias doesn't shout, Brent was saying. It speaks in small decisions. Ones we think no one notices until someone does. And then we have to decide if we double down or grow up. Kale watched a few moments longer. Brent didn't speak with charisma. He didn't grandstand. But the sincerity in his lowered gaze, the way he left pauses to breathe before continuing, it struck Kale harder than any press conference ever could. Jaren's path came through less formally. A security contractor Kale had once worked with emailed him, ran into your old gate agent, Jaren Vale. He's doing intake training now at Northspan Regional. Seems like he's keeping his head down, working hard. Thought you'd want to know. Kale didn't reply. He sat in his office as dusk draped over the skyline, the last amber light streaking across the floor-to-ceiling windows of Corvinix headquarters. His coat was draped over the back of his chair. The silence was restful, not empty. He thought of what Devin, the intern from row 17, had once written. Your silence was louder than any shout. He hadn't expected the ripple. He hadn't intended to inspire reflection in those who wronged him. But perhaps that's why it mattered. Not because he forced change, but because he didn't force himself into its center. Kale leaned back in his chair. A soft buzz from his desk monitor showed the internal quarterly metrics loading, passenger satisfaction, crew retention, disciplinary reviews. A new culture was taking shape. He didn't need to oversee every brick in its construction. The blueprint had already shifted. He pressed his fingertips together and whispered to no one in particular. The point was never to be thanked. And with a faint smile, he turned off the monitor. The point wasn't to be thanked. It was to ignite change without having to hold the flame forever. Sometimes justice whispers, and that's loud enough. The cabin door of Lyran Jet 3 hissed shut with a soft finality. Dr. Kale Dravik stepped past it without fanfare, the soft soles of his shoes making almost no sound on the pristine flooring. A sleek silver plaque rested just to the left of the entryway, its engraving catching the overhead light. This aircraft belongs equally to every passenger aboard. Respect does not upgrade. It begins at the gate. He paused only for a fraction of a second as he passed it, long enough to acknowledge it, not long enough to linger. This was not a moment for ceremony. Not for him. A flight attendant, young, male, and clearly briefed on who Kale was, offered a quiet nod. "Welcome aboard, sir," he said, his voice low and composed. Kale responded with a short nod, not cold but purposeful, and kept walking down the aisle past first class. He was not here to occupy that space, though it was rightfully his. Today was about legacy, not luxury. He chose 16C, the aisle seat beside 2 young engineers already deep in animated conversation. Their backpacks were tucked neatly beneath the seats in front of them, and both looked up as Kale sat. One of them, no older than 25, blinked and leaned slightly toward his companion. "Hey, I think that's him," he whispered just loud enough for Kale to catch it. Kale didn't respond right away. He adjusted his jacket, folded his hands, and glanced out the window at the tarmac. A warm breeze tousled the edge of the service stairs outside, and beyond it, a crowd of media personnel stood behind a cordon, their cameras angled toward the aircraft that marked the beginning of a new chapter in aviation. The younger of the 2 engineers gathered the courage to speak. "Sir, you're the guy from Flight 909, right?" Kale turned toward him, meeting his gaze evenly. There was no pride in his voice, only a calm acceptance. "Not anymore," he said, extending a hand. "Now I'm just a passenger who believes the altitude should match the attitude." The young man shook his hand, almost reverently. His companion nodded slowly, struck silent. The moment passed, but its weight lingered in the air. As the aircraft began to taxi, Kale watched the cabin. It was spotless, sleek leather seating, calming ambient lighting, equal service being offered to both first and economy by attendants who no longer wore Shark Division on their sleeves. Every uniform bore the new emblem of Lyran Air, a soaring arc intersecting a rising line, meant to represent both flight and fairness. The new culture wasn't just visual. It was structural. Every aircraft in the Lyran Air fleet had undergone a service training overhaul. Attendants were now evaluated not only on efficiency, but empathy. Cameras installed discreetly in the cabin streamed live, not for surveillance, but for internal audits that ensured every passenger's experience was consistent and just. It was a system designed to correct before complaints even arose. Still, Kale knew culture wasn't changed through policy alone. It was changed through example. That's why he chose to sit here, beside interns and engineers, not executives and champagne flutes. Visibility mattered. Quiet decisions spoke volumes. The flight took off into a soft lavender sky, and Kale's thoughts drifted to a year prior. The sting of that morning still flickered behind his calm eyes, not out of anger, but as a reminder. Not of insult, but of ignition. He had been displaced without cause, humiliated with a smirk, and dismissed with bureaucratic shrugging. And instead of shouting, he had acted. Precisely. Strategically. Decisively. But what endured wasn't the takeover. It was the transformation. As the seatbelt sign blinked off and attendants moved down the aisle offering equal service to all, Kale felt a kind of stillness settle over him. The engineer beside him fidgeted with a napkin, then glanced sideways. "Did you ever think it would go this far?" he asked. Kale considered the question, his expression unreadable. "I thought it would go as far as respect could carry it," he said. The engineer nodded, unsure how to respond. Silence filled the space between them, not awkward but thoughtful. In the row ahead, a father helped his young son fasten his seatbelt again. The boy's voice was soft. "Dad, who decides who sits in first class?" His father responded, equally quiet. "Used to be someone else. Now it's people like him." He nodded backwards subtly. Cale heard it and said nothing. The plane continued its smooth ascent, slicing through the last of the clouds into open blue. In the cockpit, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. On behalf of Lion Air, thank you for joining us on this launch flight. Today isn't just about reaching a destination. It's about how we treat each other getting there." The passengers clapped softly, not out of formality, but resonance. Cale leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and exhaled. The journey wasn't over. It never really would be. But the altitude was finally right. The aircraft lifted into clear skies, and with it, a message that would outlast even the longest flight. Respect, once airborne, never descends. 9 minutes later, the CEO bought the jet, fired the crew instantly, and left the cabin in stunned silence. If you believe true authority acts decisively to correct injustice, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights prejudice, arrogance, and the swift consequences when entitlement is met with authority and strategic action. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and respect for every individual, regardless of status or background.